Welcome back to the National Endowment for Financial Education's Focus on FinEd, the Policy Convenings series. I'm Dr. Billy Hensley, President and CEO of NEFE. In this mini-series of podcasts, we explore where the fields of financial education and financial well-being are headed, based on policy convenings we held in partnership with the Council for Economic Education, with advocates and stakeholders around the country. Welcome to Episode 2. In Episode 1, I provided a summary of how these convenings came to be and why we want to continue these important conversations through this limited series podcast. Today, we are taking a deeper dive into our first convening, and the one that has been the most interest to the field based on the number of times the event summary has been downloaded on NEFE.org. It is on the topic of financial education's role in equitable access to post-secondary education and training. Studies show that choices American students are making, or rather not making, to pursue post-secondary education is having an impact on our country's ability to compete in an increasing global economy. For many students in the U.S., pursuing post-secondary education doesn't seem like a realistic option. Equitable access to post-secondary education, especially for low-income students and students of color, does not exist. This convening focused on financial education's role in helping students navigate financial life after high school and increasing access for traditionally underrepresented populations. We gather higher education leaders, state policymakers, and education access advocates together to discuss this important topic. To lead us through a discussion of next steps is Raven Newberry, who was recently elevated to the role of Director of Policy and Advocacy at NEFE, and our special guest, Rachel Yanoff, a post-secondary access advocate. Raven, take it away.
Thank you, Billy, and thank you, Rachel, for joining us today. So Rachel is a post-secondary access advocate and an education thought leader within K-12 and beyond. Due to her expertise in this area, she served as the moderator for this convening. We're really excited to have her here today to continue the conversation. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. To help ground us in this topic, I want to start by asking what your takeaways were from this particular convening.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a really fun meeting to convene. So many great ideas. I think a couple big things jumped out, right? That the exciting parts, there's so much passion and energy for this topic. And we need that because no one else is going to shepherd it forward as much as educators and thinkers in this sort of, economic education space. Just like many things in education, there's not just one answer. And that really is what jumped out, is that there's so many ways to think about how we better inform students and parents and educators and teachers and everybody about integrating this into their work, and that it's pervasive across all levels of education. We can't just decide at junior year of high school to start talking to students about how they balance their checkbooks or how money works or how the economic systems in America were created. It's sort of got to be integrated in as early as pre-K and as late as considering that many, many adults still don't understand many of these concepts. So I think there's a lot of energy about a lot of topics, but those were the big things that stuck with me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I this was mentioned in our intro, but this was our most popular convening summary on Downloaded. So just speaking to that passion and interest on this particular topic from our field. So just thinking about what you were saying with, this is pervasive throughout all levels at K-12, convening participants shared stories of how some students make the choice to bypass post-secondary education as early as middle school. What needs to be done to adequately meet the needs of students when they are making these types of key decisions?
So many things. I think, so one initial reaction is that we shouldn't take it as students are never going to change their minds. I think it's an interesting idea, right? There's maybe middle school students who have seen a different path or a different route or have made a decision, but it doesn't mean that they won't come back when they're 25 or they're 29. And we know, because we have so much data about post-secondary, the students do come back. They work for a while. They recognize, oh man, I can't move to that next level without this opportunity. And it's certainly why we talked about a lot with high school and post-secondary. There needs to be on-ramps and off-ramps given that life is not linear, right? I mean, it would be wonderful if every kiddo had a really stable life and they never had to think about getting a job or supporting their family when they're 16. But that is not the case, unfortunately, for many kiddos. They do have to make these tough choices. There's an interesting world right now where students are seeing new careers like influencers on social media, and those people don't necessarily need to have a degree. I would argue that we will find out over time it's going to be advantageous in any field, but sometimes I feel like the old stodgy person, and I'm only 40 when I'm saying to kiddos, like, you need to go to school. And they're like, no, you don't even know what these things are. You don't even have Snapchat or Twitter or things like that, right? So I do think that maybe our adult reaction is maybe not to panic so much. At the same time, I also will say there are a lot of ways we can do a better job of communicating about the plethora of options that post-secondary represents so that students don't count themselves out. The military is an extremely viable option and has a lot of post-secondary programs. The trade, sort of what we would have called trade schools and now sort of more called career technical education, all of those are extremely interesting to young people, and they don't even know those pathways always exist. So I would say that that's on us as the adults. And then I would lastly say, just on the topic of like financing, right? My own 8-year-old, I have 6-year-old, 8-year-old, and 10-year-old, and my own 8-year-old was asking me when I took half of his birthday money away for college fund, right? And he said, well, Mommy, how much does college really cost? And I said $50,000 a year. I just picked a number, and he said, yeah, I don't think I want to spend that much. And it was just a really funny response where I recognized, we're trying to create well-educated economic thinkers. And in his mind, he hadn't been told yet the return on investment. And he's 8, we have time, I'm not worried. But It was a moment of me recognizing that we need to continue to do that for all of our students and make sure at every grade level, especially in middle school, that we're not just saying you have to go to college, but we're saying, here's what that can get you. And that students, they're savvy. They will make those decisions.
Yes, I love that. And emphasizing the return on investment because, hearing $50,000 a year, that's going to give someone sticker shock, including a young child. I'm glad you're having those conversations. And that's awesome. So that reminds me of, especially you talking about influencers and things that are contributing to how people are making or how young people are making their post-secondary decisions. One of the things that surfaced from the convening was, this was a quote, "The choice to not pursue post-secondary education should be based on personal preference and not on financial barriers." So what can we do to ensure that financial concerns don't dominate the decision-making process?
Yeah, I would say this is not just one sector's thing to solve, right? Because it is huge. One, I mean, I haven't put my kids through college yet, but given that I know as much as I do, having worked in post-secondary and K-12, I am still confused as to the various pathways and different opportunities for how we would pay for post-secondary. And it's not all at once. If you get into a school, then you have to wait 6 weeks to find out what kind of a scholarship you got. And then if you know enough, you know that you can go in and you can sort of debate and pursue a different option. But not many people know that. And so I would say this is where simplifying systems would be really helpful. I think for our students, for our families, to have it be clear that there is a state aid system so this is that's a policy level, that's not on teachers necessarily, but then also on the educator side to help our students understand what different kinds of loans there are. I know I had a student when I was running my high school that their family didn't understand the difference between these federal loans that were really low interest rate and putting it on a credit card. And that was terrifying to us as the educators, but also a moment of recognizing to them, they just saw, well, it's debt either way, right? And so helping people understand that there are different kinds of debt. But I would also say, again, back to we don't have to have such a complicated system because the system being complicated, it hurts people with the least educational access the most, right? And so I think there are a lot of levels of fix and then it's a personal choice. It's not, well, I got into, Harvard, but then they sent me the bill for $80,000 and I just said no. And we know students make those choices. And there's so many ways that could be better.
Yes.
And Harvard's a great school, but it's expensive.
Yes. No shade to Harvard here. So, Rachel, what do you think are the biggest factors contributing to inequitable post-secondary access for American students?
Oh, man. So many, unfortunately. So on an academic level, our lowest income students are generally the most, even though on paper it looks like more dollars are being spent and you have title funds and things like that, it's still the need is so great when we think about students coming with food insecurities, housing insecurities, health inequities, and then they show up to school, and even if there's more dollars at school, a fancy textbook doesn't solve all of that. So I would say it really starts at these sort of baseline determinants of health level. And I certainly have a lot of experience working in Title I schools. And I know it's a lot to ask families and teachers to take on these big sort of societal level questions. And then teachers tend to turn over more often, tend to be younger, less experienced, even with great young teachers. And I don't mean to say you can't be a great teacher out the gate, but it does take some time to really build that rapport and build that confidence in the classroom and understand your content. And so that in and of itself creates an inequity. Often there's less CTE courses or IB programs or AP programs, or just that level of rigor is less prevalent in many of our low-income sort of Title I high schools across America. And so again, access to that kind of content and rigor. And that's before we even get to the question of, do you have guidance counselors? Is there somebody there who can help you think about a post-secondary plan? In Arizona, we have one of the highest student to counselor ratios in the country. And so, if you're a counselor in a school and you're in charge of the master schedule, you're in charge of every sort of emotional, which is certainly going to happen in high schools, sort of challenge, because that's sort of been bucketed in the counselor category. And you're supposed to also be the post-secondary going person. And you've got 900 kiddos or 800 kiddos that you're seeing. It's probably likely something's going to fall apart or get missed. And so all of that exacerbates the gaps, right? And then let's say you do have all that really great infrastructure and nothing I've said is true, we still have the gap and the barrier of cost. I do respect that post-secondary institutions have tried so hard to make post-secondary, as close to free as possible. And in many cases, it is free if you are from a low-income community. But there's a lot of, as we talked about, systems and structures and red tape and things you have to fill out and forms you have to make sure you get back in on time. And those things can be barriers to access, even if it is quote unquote free.
Yeah, students have so much to navigate, and that's a lot to take on at that age. It's a lot to take on at any age. Something that we heard was from the convenings is we need to hear students share these stories, that it could lead to more fruitful discussions, help people understand what that experience is like, help educators, counselors meet them where they're at. How do you think that we can ensure students do have a place at the table when we're discussing things like access?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. It's also one of those, it's sort of a chicken and egg question, right? Because often students don't know what the challenge is until they're right in the middle of it. And they're in the middle of it and they're just trying to get through the challenge, right? So to say, oh, time out. Now you're dealing with all this annoying, paperwork, or you missed that deadline. Could you sit and talk to us more about how that was annoying for you? So I recognize that, we have to be thoughtful. And we also have to make sure that when we're listening to their stories, this is something I had to learn over time, is listening to their stories and having them share their stories is great, but to what end? Who's in the room? Who can actually do something about that? Because if they can't, then it's a little bit like we're just reinforcing what we already believe and know, but we're not fixing anything. So I do think it's important. I think it's important to have, policymakers hear it with an adult in the room who can say, and here's the policy, or here's the change in that policy that needs to happen, so that we're not leaving it out to a 17-year-old to hope that their words make that connection point. Or to a principal, if a student's struggling, that the principal can hear, here's the way I can actuate that change, or here's a funding source that could help me hire somebody to do that thing, or here's a post-secondary nonprofit partner who could help me bridge that gap and get some more people in the room, right? So I just want to make sure we don't just hear kids' stories without thinking about how the kid's story turns into an action, or at least a very clear call to action.
Yes, I love that. And also I'm thinking also ensuring it's worth that person's time, that student's time. I know we heard a theme of sort of data collection fatigue from certain populations where it's like, hey, I've told you this, but at a certain point, you need to help me navigate this, or actually, as to your point, make actionable changes in policy or provide additional supports to those students. So yeah, thank you for that answer. I think that's very thoughtful. One of the other framings of this convenings was the idea that financial education, this was sort of our bread and butter here at the National Endowment for Financial Education. We recognize that financial education alone cannot solve this problem of post-secondary access by any means. And financial knowledge cannot necessarily override philosophies set by community and culture. Can you speak to why community and culture play such a major role in post-secondary access decisions?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll do my best. I fully own I am a white, heterosexual woman from a middle-class background. So I can say what I've observed, but I want to be honest about certainly not first experience lived. money is intensely personal. I have learned this with my families that I was serving. And so most of the students that I served when I was a teacher, when I ran 3 schools, and then even in post-secondary space, most of our students were Latino and Black. We worked a lot with the Native American community in the post-secondary space. So in that space, I got to spend some time. And what I saw was, depending on how your parents thought about money, that was the most driving factor for how you would think about money. And so many of our students, when I was working in K-12, their parents had at some point immigrated to America from Mexico and had a very strong distrust of banks. Historically, that banking system wasn't something that they trusted. And so to ask students to then go to a bank to get a loan was, it was kind of like if someone told my kids, if you really want to buy a car, you should go to that used car salesman on the corner, right? I'd be like, there's probably a better system, right? So I think that's where our parents had this like weird duality, right? Of these people at this school or that I trust who I've spent 4 years with, who have gotten me to this point, are telling me one thing, but my family is like, everything in my culture has told me this isn't okay. So that, I think, was huge, to recognize that we need to be meeting families where they're at with systems that they can trust, with advocates or emissaries who look like them and sound like them, who can say like, this is actually great. And I know that they've done a lot of great work around like giving circles and working with Latina moms to start actually building some infrastructure of like trust about the banking system in America, but through other moms. So in this really thoughtful cultural way to say, here's another person that you would hear and listen to and see yourself in. So I think those are the kinds of things. I would also say one of the things that we found is that for a lot of families that hadn't experienced a post-secondary institution before, the sort of idea that debt was okay for this, but it wasn't okay for other things was very hard, right? It's like, well, why would I spend $50,000 on that? I want to go get a new car and I'm going to do that instead, right? So again, trying to recognize that it's not because families don't love and believe in and care for their children deeply. And I think I, in my early years, made judgments of people that were really unfair. It was that it was a number, right? 50,000 for this or 50,000 for that. They seemed equal. And that was where they were coming from. So I guess I would just say that, we have this sort of underlying American, I don't even know what the right word is, norm that you don't talk about religion and politics and money, right? Like those are the 3 things. Like you don't talk about your family, you don't talk about it with anybody. And suddenly we are asking people to come into high school and write down, how much money did you make? How much taxes did you pay? That's hard for every culture when you've also said this other sort of American ethos of we don't talk about these things. Heaven forbid, in the workplace, you talk about how much money you make. So I do think that there actually is a sort of societal change we all need to work on of, let's talk about how much money we make in jobs. Let's post salaries when we post them, because we need to normalize talking about money so that students and families can talk about it, because they have to be so personal when they're applying for some of these grants or these programs or looking at state aid, all those things. So those are my thoughts.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, personal finance is extremely personal. And your point about, we're asking families to share all this extremely intimate details about their finances. And I know I'm thinking about just navigating FAFSA. You get the estimated family contribution, and that can be really shocking to a lot of families of like, oh, we actually don't have this amount that's being estimated that we're supposed to be offering up. And to your point about parents being such a source of influence on students, if a parent hasn't gone to post-secondary education or hasn't pursued those things, they might not have sort of the language or values to pass on to students, or, it might not even see like, this path makes sense for me. So thank you for sharing all of that. My last question is, so we're really thinking about like when properly implemented, we think personal financial education and financial literacy can really help set young adults on a path to achieving their personal and professional goals. Do you know of anyone who is really doing this right and could be a model for other communities?
I think many people are doing it right. But I would say from the sort of cultural lens, one of the things I've really enjoyed watching is in Arizona, we have this organization called Local First Arizona, and they really wanted to take on the idea of the unbanked community, right? Why is there this huge population of people who are not even in the banking system? And they're the ones who started this sort of Madres Giving Circle. And it was really based in how do people who are traditionally leery of the financial system, period, how do they maneuver the world? And they realize that there's this sort of, and this happens in lots of cultures, but the idea was like, there's this sort of behind the scenes giving community where, I pitch in $20, I pitch in, and somebody gets the pot and then they go buy the truck they need to be able to get themselves to their next job. And there's this idea that then the next time it'll be my turn to get the pot and I can go buy whatever it is I need. And so Local First took on this idea and said, well, could we sort of institutionalize that, match it with the actual, lending institution and build some infrastructure there. And then they've been trying to, and again, it's not pervasive yet in many schools, but to take that idea, and now that we have the parents and mostly it's moms, thinking in this fashion and trusting an institution, can we help them sign their kiddos up for a savings account? Can we help them sign their kids up for some sort of banking experience that is with their parents and is supportive? And I just would say that, to me, it's not the system that's changing the world yet. It's just like the fact that it started with, what would you trust and how do we build from there? And I know that there are lots of cool institutions across the country where, with different communities, they're doing different approaches similar, right? Saying, where can we start from? And I think that is the best, because when I do think about some of these national, curriculum is great. We all believe in curriculum. We all want to make sure we're part of Common Core, and we're implementing some high level standards. But for all of us educators out there, right, we know that the standard it's intended to be general enough that you can apply it locally, right? Like, your students and what they're going to hear. And I think that's where we want to be making the magic happen is, yes, please know how to do these core functions so you can be personally and professionally successful. But that might look different than it would have growing up in my house, when I was a kiddo and my parents told me things. And that's okay, because maybe it'll make us all better.
Yeah, I love that. And thank you for sharing that example from Arizona. I just want to highlight for listeners, if interested in sort of community trust building, our topics on financial education in rural communities and our conversations on how financial education can better support diverse communities, super relevant there. Meeting a community where they're at, asking them, what are the strengths here? What would you trust? And going from there are absolutely huge themes that were part of those conversations too. So I appreciate you bringing those up. And I actually lied. I have another question. So I think I said the last one was the last one. And you've touched on this with a few of your answers, but we know there are promising policy recommendations for post-secondary institutions to increase college affordability and access. Things like simplifying the process, providing more aid to specific populations, things like receiving upfront application cost. So to really help these students who are coming from communities who historically have had less access to financial resources or are more likely to experience a higher debt burden. So these recommendations can be made to policymakers, and recent research highlighting K-12. Do you have any recommendations, Rachel, that you would make on this topic?
Yeah, and it came up in our convening a lot, but there's a few programs across the country. The one that I know the most specifically is called Earn to Learn. And the idea being that you work with families in high school, and they basically, as a family, student and parent, learn about savings. They save $50 a month. If they do their part, so over the 4 years, they save about $500, we'll say, then the program itself matches, I think it's like $4,000. So it's a huge return for what you're putting in. But the notion is that it is making the sort of savings and the cost of post-secondary, you have to go to in-state school, but it's making it very transparent because there's a coach and supporting you along the way. It's changing behaviors, right? It's teaching slowly over time that savings has not only a benefit, but a match that's huge, right? So there's a sort of added bonus. And it is helping students to be more critical and ask the questions up front of how much does this cost? How much is this education that I'm pursuing going to cost and give back? And so I think programs such as that are phenomenal. I think Earn to Learn as a national model could be pretty phenomenal, because it would actually help us to answer the question of what do you get for the dollars that you're spending. I also like the idea that it helps students be advocates for themselves. There's not a policy one-liner that I can give on that, but helping students to have the tools to be critical, to challenge in a positive way. Why are you charging me on this? What's this? Do I have to have this? Do I not have to have this? I think it'd be huge. So that's, I guess, one soapbox. I do think that we made a huge leap as a society when the Common App was created. The idea that students could apply to a bunch of schools at once and save themselves a lot of chasing their own tail. I think that it wouldn't be impossible to start some sort of common funding, and it might only exist state by state. I've been in the world long enough to understand that state funding is a huge component of how especially state schools are funded. But if state schools led the way, and I think they could lead the way in financial transparency in a way that would just be, I think, really helpful for young people. And I know that they're trying. So I want to also give credit. People are really trying to work on this. There's a lot of variables, but I think that that would be a huge win for any state to take the lead of, we're just going to simplify and also be transparent about where these dollars and cents are coming from and going.
Awesome. Thank you. Rachel, would you be willing to share where our listeners can follow your work and your thoughts going forward?
I would be more than excited for that. You can find me on LinkedIn. I was teasing earlier, my husband's family made up their last name. So I'm one of 7 Yanoffs in the world. As long as you spell it right, you'll find me, Yanof. And 3 of them are under 10, so they're not going to be online. So you will find me, and I would be happy. This is a really important topic.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel. We so appreciate your passion and your insights. We loved having you as our MC for this convening, and it's been so great continuing this conversation with you today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, Rachel. Billy, do you have any final words?
Yes, thanks Raven and Rachel for the thoughtful conversation. I would like to mention that if listeners are interested in reading more about this convening, the report is available to download at www.nefe.org under Initiatives. Stay tuned for our next episode, where we head in a bit of a different direction to talk about alternatives to state-funded mandates for teaching financial education. Thanks for joining, and we will see you next time.
Focus on FinEd, the Policy Convenings, is produced by the National Endowment for Financial Education, a 501c3 nonprofit that is the independent, centralizing voice, providing leadership, research, and collaboration to advance financial education and financial well-being. The opinions and statements made on this podcast are those of the podcast participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of NEFE or constitute statements supported by NEFE. Links to our event summaries and any other documents discussed in this session are available in the show notes. For more information, visit www.nefe.org.